I'm Emma Thompson, and 6 months ago, I discovered something that shattered every belief I had about family loyalty. My best friend Grace called me in tears, her voice shaking as she read from her phone. Emma, there is an obituary here. It says you died in a car crash. My blood turned ice cold. I was very much alive, standing in my small apartment 2 towns away from Millbrook, Ohio, where I'd grown up. But according to the Millbrook Weekly Herald, Emma Thompson, beloved daughter of Richard and Patricia, had tragically perished in an accident out of state. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral was scheduled for that very afternoon at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, where my father served as deacon. A closed casket ceremony, they claimed, because the accident had been too severe. I stared at Grace through the video call, watching her horror mirror my own. They hadn't just disowned me. They had literally erased me from existence, buried me while I still drew breath, and were about to collect sympathy from an entire community that believed I was gone forever. That day, I made a decision that would expose their lies and reclaim my life in the most dramatic way possible. I decided to attend my own funeral. What happened next revealed the depths of their deception and changed everything I thought I knew about the people who were supposed to love me most. Growing up in Millbrook was like living in a Norman Rockwell painting, except the picture-perfect surface hid darker truths beneath. Our town of 15,000 people operated on unwritten rules about reputation, social standing, and keeping up appearances. The Thompson name carried weight here. My father, Richard, had worked his way up to regional manager at Millbrook Insurance, while my mother, Patricia, held court as the bank's operations manager and unofficial queen of every charity committee in town. Our colonial house on Elm Street stood as a testament to their success, with its perfectly manicured lawn and seasonal decorations that made neighbors pause to admire. Inside, family dinners happened precisely at 6. Conversations followed predictable patterns, and every detail of our lives was curated to reflect the image they wanted the community to see. I was expected to be the perfect daughter, the crown jewel of their carefully constructed reputation. For most of my childhood, I played the part beautifully. I sang solos in the church choir, earned straight A's at Millbrook High, and dated boys from the right families. My younger sister, Chloe, seemed to thrive in this environment, effortlessly charming everyone with her bubbly personality and natural ability to say exactly what our parents wanted to hear. But even then, I felt like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. The cracks began to show during my senior year, when I started dreaming beyond Millbrook's borders. While my parents envisioned me marrying a local doctor's son and settling into their version of respectability, I felt drawn to something more creative, more independent. I'd always been good with flowers and had a natural eye for making spaces beautiful. The idea of starting my own business, of building something from scratch, excited me in ways that following their predetermined path never could. After graduation, instead of accepting their plan for me to work at the bank while finding a suitable husband, I surprised everyone by enrolling in a floral design program at a community college an hour away. The tension at home became palpable. Every family dinner turned into a subtle interrogation about my future plans, with pointed comments about stability and responsibility. They'd invite the sons of their friends to church events, orchestrating casual encounters that felt more like job interviews than social interactions. But I persisted, and by age 24, I'd saved enough money to lease a small storefront on Main Street. Bloom and Celebrate opened with modest fanfare, specializing in wedding flowers and event planning for local families. The business grew slowly but steadily, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of something I'd accomplished entirely on my own. My parents' reaction was lukewarm at best, their congratulations hollow and brief, before they'd pivot to asking when I planned to settle down properly. The real trouble started when I met Jake Mitchell. He'd brought his motorcycle to Main Street Auto Repair, which shared an alley with my shop. And our paths crossed when he stopped to admire a particularly elaborate wedding arrangement I was loading into my delivery van. Jake had warm brown eyes, calloused hands that spoke of honest work, and a smile that made me forget every rule I'd been taught about suitable partners. Jake wasn't what my parents had in mind for their daughter. He fixed engines for a living, played guitar in a local band on weekends, and lived in a small apartment above his brother's garage. His family was working class, the kind of people my parents would describe as nice enough, with a tone that made it clear they weren't our social equals. But Jake had something I'd never encountered in the polished young men my parents preferred: authenticity. Our first real conversation happened over coffee at the Old Mill Diner, where Jake told me about his dream of opening a custom motorcycle shop and maybe recording an album with his band. He listened when I talked about expanding Bloom and Celebrate, about maybe franchising the concept to other small towns. He didn't try to diminish my ambitions or redirect them toward more traditional goals. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions and offered genuine encouragement. Within 3 months, we were spending most evenings together, either at his apartment where he'd cook simple but delicious meals, or at my shop where he'd help me arrange flowers while telling stories that made me laugh until my sides hurt. Jake's family embraced me from the start. His mother, Rebecca, a retired elementary school teacher, treated me like the daughter she'd never had. His father, Tom, would joke about finally having someone around who appreciated his terrible puns. Even his older brother, David, typically gruff and serious about his construction business, would light up when Jake and I visited their weekly family dinners. The contrast with my own family couldn't have been sharper. When I finally introduced Jake at Sunday dinner, the temperature in our dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father peppered him with questions about his income, his long-term career prospects, and his family background, with the subtlety of a prosecutor cross-examining a witness. My mother smiled tightly while asking leading questions about whether Jake planned to pursue further education or perhaps consider a more stable profession. Chloe, home from college for the weekend, barely looked up from her phone during the introductions.
The entire meal, occasionally rolling her eyes when Jake talked about his motorcycle work or his band. The evening ended with my parents walking Jake to the door with perfunctory politeness, while I caught the meaningful looks they exchanged behind his back. The lectures began the next day. My mother cornered me in the kitchen before work, her voice carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than controlling. She worried about my reputation, she said, about what people would think seeing me with someone so obviously beneath my station. She'd heard gossip at the bank about my relationship, whispers that reflected poorly on our family's standing in the community. My father took a different approach, appealing to my business sense during one of his visits to my shop. He suggested that my association with Jake might hurt Bloom and Celebrate, that potential clients from better families might hesitate to hire someone who couldn't make appropriate personal choices. He painted a picture of my business failing, my dreams crumbling, all because I'd chosen the wrong partner. But the more they pushed, the more determined I became to prove them wrong. Jake's love felt like freedom after a lifetime.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Time of performing for approval. With him, I could be messy and imperfect and completely myself without fear of judgment. He celebrated my successes without trying to take credit, supported my dreams without trying to reshape them, and loved me for who I actually was rather than who I might become if I followed someone else's script. The breaking point came during Millbrook's annual Harvest Festival, a weekend-long celebration that served as the town's biggest social event. I'd secured the contract to provide all the floral decorations, a huge opportunity that would establish Bloom and Celebrate as the premier event planning service in the area. Jake volunteered to help with setup, working alongside me for 2 days to transform the community center into an autumn wonderland. The festival was a tremendous success, with visitors from neighboring towns praising the beautiful decorations and asking for my business cards. Several potential clients approached me about their upcoming events, and the mayor herself complimented my work during the opening ceremony. I felt prouder than I'd ever been watching Jake beam with excitement as people praised the arrangements we'd created together. But my parents saw something different in the same scene. They watched Jake and me working as partners, laughing together as we adjusted garlands and repositioned centerpieces, and their disapproval hardened into something darker. Later, I learned that several of their friends had commented on how well-suited Jake and I seemed, how happy I looked, how refreshing it was to see young people so dedicated to building something together. These comments, meant as compliments, felt like threats to my parents' vision of my future. They'd spent months hoping my relationship with Jake would burn out naturally, that I'd eventually see reason and choose someone more appropriate. But the festival made it clear that Jake and I were building something real and lasting, something that couldn't be easily dismissed as a phase. That night, they demanded I come to the house for a family meeting. The conversation that followed would shatter our relationship and set in motion the events that led to my own funeral. But in that moment, surrounded by the beautiful decorations Jake and I had created together, I felt strong enough to face whatever they threw at me. I had no idea how far they were willing to go to maintain control over the life they'd scripted for me. The confrontation began the moment I walked into our formal living room, the space my mother reserved for important conversations and uncomfortable truths. Both parents sat stiffly on the antique sofa that had belonged to my grandmother, their faces wearing expressions I'd seen them use during church board meetings when dealing with particularly stubborn committee members. Chloe perched on the edge of a wingback chair, her earlier disinterest replaced by obvious anticipation for the drama about to unfold. My father started with his closing argument voice, the tone he used when presenting insurance claims that required delicate handling. He'd been patient, he said, hoping I'd outgrow my infatuation with inappropriate companionship. He'd watched me embarrass our family publicly, choosing someone so clearly beneath our social standing that people were beginning to question the Thompson family's judgment. The festival had been the final straw, watching me parade around town with someone who would never be anything more than a mechanic with unrealistic dreams. My mother's approach was more personal, targeting the insecurities she'd carefully cataloged over the years. She questioned my business acumen, suggesting that my success at the festival was a fluke that wouldn't sustain a real career. She wondered aloud whether I was settling for Jake because I feared I couldn't attract someone better, someone worthy of the education and advantages they had provided. Her words were surgical, designed to cut deepest where I was most vulnerable. But something had changed in me over the past year with Jake. His unwavering support had shown me what unconditional love actually felt like, and his belief in my abilities had given me confidence I'd never possessed before. Instead of wilting under their criticism as I had so many times before, I found myself standing straighter, my voice growing stronger as I defended both Jake and our relationship. I told them about the clients I'd gained through the festival, about the expansion plans I was developing for Bloom and Celebrate, about the life Jake and I were building based on mutual respect rather than social climbing. I described the warmth of their family's acceptance, the way they celebrated each other's successes instead of tearing them down. For the first time in my adult life, I spoke to my parents as an equal rather than a child seeking approval. Their reaction was swift and brutal. My father's face darkened as he delivered an ultimatum that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. I could continue this embarrassing relationship and face the consequences of disappointing my family, or I could end things with Jake and return to the path they'd laid out for me. There would be no middle ground, no compromise, no acceptance of choices that didn't align with their vision. When I chose Jake and my own happiness over their approval, the battle lines were drawn with stunning clarity. They didn't disown me immediately, but their coldness became absolute. Phone calls went unreturned. Invitations to family events stopped arriving, and the few times our paths crossed in town, they treated me with the polite distance they'd reserve for casual acquaintances. The campaign to isolate me from the community began subtly. My mother's position at the bank gave her access
Network of influential women who controlled much of Millbrook's social fabric. Suddenly, potential clients were canceling appointments, citing vague concerns about reliability or professionalism. Church members who had previously been friendly grew distant, offering tight smiles instead of the warm greetings I was accustomed to receiving. My father used his role as deacon to spread carefully worded concerns about my choices, framing his disappointment as a parent's legitimate worry about a daughter who'd lost her way. He never said anything directly critical, but his sighs and meaningful looks spoke volumes to a congregation that had watched me grow up. People began treating me with the same pitying kindness they'd show someone battling addiction or going through a mental health crisis. The pressure was relentless and increasingly effective. Bloom & Celebrate's bookings dropped dramatically as former clients found reasons to take their business elsewhere. The landlord, who'd been flexible about rent payments, suddenly became rigid about deadlines, and I suspected my parents had influenced his change in attitude. Even some of my longtime friends began distancing themselves, unwilling to choose sides in what had become an increasingly public family conflict. Jake watched my world shrink with growing anger and frustration. He urged me to fight back, to expose my parents' manipulation and stand up for myself publicly. But I still harbored hope that time would soften their stance, that eventually they'd see how happy I was and accept the life I'd chosen. I underestimated both their determination to control my future and their willingness to destroy me if I continued to resist. The final confrontation came 6 months ago, during what I thought would be a last attempt at reconciliation. I'd asked to meet with them privately, hoping to find some common ground that would allow us to repair our fractured relationship. Instead, I walked into an ambush designed to break my spirit once and for all. They'd prepared for this meeting like a military operation, with documents and evidence of my business's declining performance, testimonials from community members expressing concern about my choices, and a detailed plan for how I could redeem myself if I was willing to abandon everything I'd built with Jake. The message was clear: submit completely to their will or face total ostracism from the only community I'd ever known. When I refused their terms and walked out of that meeting, I thought I was choosing freedom over control, love over manipulation. I had no idea I was actually choosing to disappear entirely from their version of reality. Within weeks, they began telling people I'd moved away for work, that I was taking time to reconsider my life choices. The story evolved gradually, becoming more elaborate and more final with each telling. By the time Grace found my obituary online, my parents had convinced an entire town that Emma Thompson was dead and buried, the victim of a tragic accident that had cut short a promising young life. They'd turned my resistance into a cautionary tale, my independence into a reason for community grief, and my love story into a tragedy that validated every warning they had ever given about the dangers of choosing poorly. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their elaborate deception. They'd assumed I would stay away forever, too broken and ashamed to ever return to Millbrook and challenge their version of events. They never imagined that their supposedly dead daughter would discover their lies and decide to make a very dramatic appearance at her own funeral service. The morning Grace called me about my obituary, I was arranging white roses for a small wedding in the next town over. My new life had settled into a peaceful rhythm in Riverside, a community 40 minutes east of Millbrook where nobody knew the Thompson family history. I'd rented a tiny studio apartment above a bakery, and the sweet smell of fresh bread had become my daily comfort. My business was slowly rebuilding under a new name, Simple Elegance Florals, serving clients who appreciated my work without questioning my personal choices. Jake had been incredible through the transition, driving over every evening after finishing work at his brother's shop. We'd spend hours planning our future, dreaming about the day we could stop hiding and build something permanently together. He'd found a small house for rent in Riverside, and we'd been discussing moving in together officially. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, I felt genuinely hopeful about what lay ahead. Then Grace's video call shattered that fragile peace. She was sitting in her car outside Millbrook General Hospital, still wearing her nursing scrubs from the night shift, tears streaming down her face as she held up her phone. The obituary photo showed my high school graduation picture, the same one my parents had displayed on the mantelpiece for 8 years. The text described a beloved daughter who had died in a tragic automobile accident while traveling out of state, survived by loving parents Richard and Patricia Thompson and cherished sister Chloe Thompson. The details were sickeningly elaborate. According to the notice, I had been pursuing business opportunities in Colorado when the accident occurred. The vehicle had been so severely damaged that identification had taken several days, explaining the delay in notification. Services would be held at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, with burial following at Pine Valley Cemetery, where my grandparents were interred. In lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the Millbrook Community Development Fund, a charity my mother had established to help struggling local businesses. Grace's voice broke as she read the final line aloud. Emma touched countless lives with her generous spirit and unwavering dedication to making every celebration beautiful. Her light will be deeply missed by all who knew her. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same parents who had spent months systematically destroying my reputation were now canonizing me in death, transforming their rebellious daughter into a tragic heroine whose memory could serve their purposes. I sat in stunned silence, watching Grace sob through the screen while my mind struggled to process the magnitude of their deception. They hadn't just cut me off or disowned me privately, they had literally erased me from existence, convincing an entire community to mourn my death while I continued living just miles away. The audacity was staggering, but even more disturbing was the calculating precision with which they had executed their plan. The obituary had been posted online that morning, but Grace suspected it had been circulating in print for days. Several of our mutual friends had already shared condolence messages on social media, expressing shock and grief over my unexpected death. Former classmates were posting memories and photos, creating a digital memorial that made my fictional demise feel terrifyingly real. The speed with which people had accepted and spread the news showed how effectively my parents had prepared the ground for this ultimate lie. Jake arrived within an hour of Grace's call, having broken several speed limits after I sent him a frantic text explaining what had happened. He found me pacing around my tiny apartment like a caged animal, alternating between rage and disbelief as I processed the implications of my parents' actions. His first reaction was protective fury, demanding we drive straight to Millbrook and expose their lies immediately. But as we talked through the situation, the complex web of consequences became clear. My parents had committed to this story publicly and dramatically. Backing down would require admitting to an elaborate fraud that would destroy their reputations and potentially result in criminal charges. They'd already accepted condolences from hundreds of people, collected memorial donations, and scheduled a funeral service that was just hours away. The deeper they'd gone with the deception, the more impossible it became for them to reverse course, without facing complete social and financial ruin. But their vulnerability also represented an opportunity for me. They'd built their lie on the assumption that I would never return to challenge it, that I was too broken and defeated to fight back. By appearing at my own funeral, I could expose their fraud in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible. Every person who had believed their story would witness the truth firsthand, and their carefully constructed reputation would crumble in spectacular fashion. The more we discussed it, the more appealing this plan became. Jake was initially worried about my safety, concerned that my parents might react violently when cornered so publicly. But I reminded him that this would happen in a church full of witnesses, with Pastor Hayes officiating and half the town in attendance. They might be manipulative and controlling, but they weren't physically dangerous, especially not in such a public setting. Grace arrived an hour later, having finished her shift early by claiming a family emergency that technically wasn't even a lie. She brought printed copies of the obituary and screenshots of the social media responses, documentation that would prove how thoroughly my parents had convinced everyone of my death. Her nursing background made her naturally methodical, and she'd already begun thinking through the logistics of my dramatic return from the grave. The three of us spent the afternoon crafting a plan that would maximize the impact of my appearance while minimizing potential legal complications. Grace researched the laws around fraud and identity theft, confirming that my parents had likely committed multiple felonies by collecting donations and sympathy under false pretenses. Jake focused on practical concerns like timing and safety, mapping out the church layout and identifying the best moment for me to make my entrance. I concentrated on the emotional preparation, trying to steel myself for the confrontation that would finally end this toxic dynamic once and for all. Part of me still felt a twisted sadness about definitively severing ties with my family, but their willingness to literally erase my existence had crossed a line that made reconciliation impossible. They'd chosen to declare me dead rather than accept my independence, and now they'd have to face the consequences of that choice. The hardest part was waiting. The funeral was scheduled at 2 o'clock, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity. I tried to distract myself by getting ready, choosing an outfit that would be unmistakably me while also being appropriate for a church service. I settled on a navy dress that my mother had always complimented, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had left me. If I was going to rise from the dead, I wanted to look like the daughter they claimed to have lost. Jake and Grace helped me practice what I would say, though we all knew that no amount of rehearsal could prepare me for the emotional intensity of the moment. I would need to be strong enough to face their shock and anger, clear enough to explain the situation to a confused congregation, and composed enough to maintain my dignity throughout what would certainly be a chaotic scene. As the afternoon wore on, Grace's phone buzzed constantly with updates from friends and acquaintances who were attending the service. The church was packed, she reported, with people standing in the back and overflow seating set up in the fellowship hall. My former teachers from high school had come, along with childhood friends, business associates of my parents, and seemingly half the congregation of St. Mark's. The community's outpouring of grief for my supposed death was both touching and infuriating, knowing how many of these same people had shunned me when I was actually alive. My parents had outdone themselves with the memorial arrangements. Grace's friends were sending photos of elaborate flower displays, professional poster boards covered with pictures from my childhood and adolescence, and a guest book where hundreds of people had already signed condolences. They'd created a shrine to the perfect daughter they'd always wanted me to be, carefully omitting any evidence of our recent conflicts or my relationship with Jake. The most disturbing detail was the closed casket at the front of the sanctuary, draped with a white pall and surrounded by the most expensive floral arrangements money could buy. Grace confirmed that people were indeed believing there was a body inside, with several mourners commenting on how tragic it was that the accident had been too severe for an open casket service. The depth of the deception was breathtaking, and I wondered what they'd actually put in the coffin to give it appropriate weight. By 1:30, I couldn't wait any longer. Jake drove while Grace navigated, taking back roads to avoid being seen by anyone who might be heading to the church. My heart pounded as familiar landmarks came into view, the first time I'd been back to Millbrook since that final confrontation with my parents 6 months ago. The town looked exactly the same, but I felt like a completely different person returning to a place that no longer held any claim on me. We parked 3 blocks away from St. Mark's, close enough to walk quickly but far enough to avoid detection. The church bells were already tolling, calling the community to witness what they believed would be my final farewell. Grace squeezed my hand as we approached the building, reminding me that whatever happened next, I wouldn't face it alone. Jake stayed close to my other side, his presence a reminder of everything I'd gained by choosing love over conformity. The moment of truth had arrived. I was about to attend my own funeral, confront the parents who had literally tried to erase me from existence, and reclaim my life in front of hundreds of witnesses.
Everyone who had believed their lies. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, but my resolve had never been stronger. Emma Thompson was about to rise from the dead, and Millbrook would never be the same. Standing outside the church where I'd sung in the choir for 10 years, where I'd been confirmed and celebrated countless milestones, I took one final deep breath. The sound of hymns drifted through the heavy wooden doors, and I could picture the congregation inside, heads bowed in grief for someone who was very much alive and ready to reclaim her story. This was it. This was my moment to show them all that you can't bury someone who refuses to stay dead. The elaborate nature of my parents' deception became even more apparent as we approached the church entrance. A professional funeral director stood near the door, greeting mourners with practiced solemnity and directing them to sign the memorial guest book. Someone had hired actual funeral staff to make this charade more convincing, which meant my parents had spent considerable money on this performance. The guest book itself was leather-bound and expensive, the kind of thing typically reserved for actual deaths rather than elaborate family lies. Grace had been feeding me information throughout the day about who was attending, but seeing the parking lot packed with familiar cars brought the reality into sharp focus. My high school principal's Honda was there, along with the mayor's distinctive red pickup truck. I spotted the vehicles belonging to my mother's book club, my father's golf buddies, and what seemed like half the congregation of St. Mark's. They'd mobilized the entire community to mourn someone who was standing right outside, very much alive and increasingly angry. The flowers were visible through the church's stained glass windows, massive arrangements that must have cost thousands of dollars. I recognized the style immediately as the work of Petals and Blooms, the high-end florist from the county seat who specialized in elaborate funeral displays. My parents had spared no expense in creating a memorial worthy of their fictional perfect daughter, the one who had died tragically rather than live authentically. Jake checked his watch and nodded. According to Grace's intel, Pastor Hayes would be about 15 minutes into his eulogy, the perfect moment for maximum dramatic impact. We'd timed this carefully to avoid disrupting the opening prayers and hymns, but to arrive before the service concluded and people began to leave. I needed the full congregation present to witness what was about to unfold. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace, who had slipped inside 10 minutes earlier to scout the situation and provide real-time updates. Standing room only, your parents in front row, crying. Chloe looks genuinely upset. Pastor talking about your generous spirit and devotion to family. This is unreal. Her messages confirmed what I'd expected, but also added a layer of complexity I hadn't fully considered. Some people here were genuinely grieving, believing they'd lost someone they cared about. That realization gave me pause for a moment. By exposing this lie, I would shock and potentially traumatize people who had come here in good faith to honor my memory. Childhood friends who had fond memories of growing up together, teachers who had invested in my education, neighbors who had watched me mature into adulthood. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of this family war. But then I reminded myself that they were already victims of my parents' manipulation. These good people had been deceived, used as props in an elaborate performance designed to serve my parents' need for control and sympathy. Their genuine grief was being exploited to validate a lie, and they deserved to know the truth about what had been done to them. My appearance would be shocking, but it would also free them from participating unknowingly in this fraud. Grace's next message ramped up my urgency. Pastor just said you died doing what you loved, pursuing your dreams. The hypocrisy is making me sick. Hurry up! The irony was almost too much to bear. Here was Pastor Hayes, a man who had baptized me and confirmed me, telling a church full of people that I had died pursuing my dreams when my parents had systematically destroyed those very dreams while I was alive. Jake squeezed my shoulder one final time. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice gentle but determined. I nodded, knowing that there was no turning back now. We'd come too far, and the lie had gone too deep for any solution other than dramatic truth-telling. I straightened my shoulders, checked my appearance one last time in Jake's side mirror, and prepared to make an entrance that would be talked about in Millbrook for decades to come. The funeral director at the entrance did a double take as I approached, his professional composure slipping for just a moment.
I could see the confusion in his eyes as his brain tried to process why someone who looked exactly like the deceased was walking toward the church. But his training kicked in quickly, and he simply nodded politely, assuming I must be a cousin or relative who bore a strong resemblance to the departed. Grace's final text came through as I reached for the door handle. Pastor wrapping up eulogy, about to invite people to share memories. Perfect timing. Everyone here. Good luck. This was it. In 30 seconds, Emma Thompson was going to walk into her own funeral and shatter every assumption these people had about death, family, and truth. I pulled open the heavy wooden door of St. Mark's Lutheran Church, the familiar creak echoing through the narthex, just as it had countless times during my childhood. The sound of Pastor Hayes' voice carried clearly from the sanctuary, his practiced funeral cadence lending gravity to words about my fictional demise. Emma Thompson lived a life of service and joy, taken from us far too soon, but leaving behind a legacy of love that will endure forever. The sanctuary was indeed packed, exactly as Grace had reported. Every pew was filled, with people standing along the walls and more visible through the archway to the fellowship hall. I could see the backs of heads I'd known since childhood, neighbors and friends and community leaders all gathered to bid farewell to someone who had never left. The sight was both overwhelming and infuriating, this massive outpouring of grief based entirely on my parents' elaborate lie. Pastor Hayes had paused in his eulogy and was inviting people to come forward and share memories of my life. This was the moment Grace had identified as perfect for my entrance, when attention would be focused on the front of the church and people would be emotionally primed for personal reflections about who I had been. Several hands were already rising, people preparing to stand and share stories about the Emma Thompson they
remembered. I stepped through the doorway into the sanctuary proper, my footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors, despite my efforts to move quietly. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the hushed atmosphere, and I saw several people in the back rows turn to see who was arriving late to the service. Their faces registered confusion first, then shock, then something approaching terror as they recognized exactly who they were looking at. The reaction spread through the congregation like wildfire, whispers and gasps rippling forward from the back of the church toward the front, where my parents sat in the place of honor reserved for immediate family. I continued walking down the center aisle, my eyes fixed on the closed casket that supposedly contained my mortal remains, flanked by photographs of my life that told a carefully edited version of my story. Pastor Hayes was still speaking, unaware of the commotion building behind him as more and more people realized that the guest of honor had arrived at her own funeral. His voice faltered slightly as he noticed the disturbance, his eyes scanning the congregation for the source of the disruption. When his gaze finally landed on me, halfway down the aisle and approaching steadily, his face went completely white. "Emma," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly through the church's excellent acoustics despite being barely audible. That single word, spoken with such shock and confusion, seemed to freeze everyone in place. The whispers stopped, the movement stopped. Even breathing seemed to pause as an entire community tried to process what they were seeing. My parents still had their backs to me, seated in the front pew with Chloe between them. I could see my mother's shoulders shaking with what the congregation would interpret as grief, but which I suspected was actually panic. My father sat rigidly upright, his hand clasped over my mother's, in a gesture that looked supportive, but was probably meant to keep her from turning around and revealing their horror to the watching crowd. I reached the front of the sanctuary and stopped directly in front of the casket that was supposed to contain my body. The flowers were even more elaborate up close, arrangements that must have cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. White roses, lilies, and orchids cascaded from every available surface, transforming the altar into something that belonged in a cathedral rather than a small-town church. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's shocked silence. "I'm sorry I'm late to my own funeral." The silence that followed my announcement was unlike anything I had ever experienced.
It felt heavy and electric, as if the very air in the sanctuary had become charged with disbelief. 300 people sat frozen in their pews, their minds struggling to reconcile the impossible sight before them with everything they thought they knew about death and reality. Some rubbed their eyes, convinced they were hallucinating. Others reached for their neighbors' hands, seeking confirmation that they weren't experiencing some kind of collective delusion. Pastor Hayes gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he tried to formulate a response to a situation that no seminary had prepared him for. The man who had delivered countless eulogies, who prided himself on maintaining composure during the most difficult moments of grief, looked like he was seeing a ghost, which, from his perspective, he absolutely was. My mother was the first to break. She turned in her seat with jerky, puppet-like movements, her face a mask of horror that she couldn't quite hide behind her black funeral veil. When our eyes met across the small distance separating the front pew from the altar, I saw something I'd never witnessed before in Patricia Thompson's carefully controlled features. Pure, undiluted terror. Not surprise, not shock, but the deep fear of someone whose entire world was about to collapse in the most public way possible. My father's reaction was more calculating. He remained facing forward for several long seconds, his shoulders rigid with tension as his lawyer's mind undoubtedly raced through the legal implications of what was happening. When he finally turned to look at me, his expression was a complex mixture of rage, panic, and something that might have been grudging respect for the audacity of my move. He knew immediately that there was no way to explain this away, no spin that could salvage their reputation from this catastrophic exposure. Chloe's response was the most genuine. My sister let out a strangled cry that echoed through the sanctuary, her hand flying to her mouth as tears began streaming down her cheeks. For a moment, I couldn't tell if she was crying from relief that I was alive or terror at what my appearance meant for our family. Her reaction suggested that she might have been one of the few people who genuinely believed I was dead, which added another layer of complexity to the web of lies my parents had constructed. The congregation began finding their voices as the initial shock wore off. Whispers started in the back rows and spread forward like ripples on a pond. Is that really Emma? How is this possible? What's going on here? Someone call 911. The funeral director who had greeted me at the door was speaking urgently into his phone, probably calling his supervisor to report that they had a serious problem with their corpse situation. Mrs. Helen Carter, our elderly neighbor who had lived next door to my family for 30 years, stood up in her pew and pointed a shaking finger in my direction. "Emma Thompson, you explain yourself this instant!" she demanded in the same voice she'd used when catching neighborhood children stealing apples from her tree. Her indignation was almost amusing, as if my failure to stay properly dead was somehow a personal affront to her sensibilities. Grace had positioned herself strategically in the middle section of the sanctuary, and I could see her recording everything on her phone while trying to look inconspicuous. Smart thinking. We'd need documentation of this moment, both for legal purposes and because no one would believe the story without proof. Jake remained near the back entrance, ready to intervene if things got ugly or provide backup if we needed to make a quick exit. My high school English teacher, Mrs. Davidson, was among the first to recover her composure enough to speak coherently. She stood up slowly, her voice carrying the same authority she'd used in the classroom for 40 years. "Emma, dear, we all thought you were dead. There was a car accident, they said. We've been mourning you for days." Her confusion was heartbreaking, and I felt a pang of guilt for the pain my parents' deception had caused innocent people. "There was no car accident," I replied, my voice stronger now as I found my balance, "and I'm not here to cause any harm. I'm here to speak the truth."
Found my rhythm. There was no death. The only thing that died was my parents' ability to control my life, so they decided to solve that problem by telling everyone I didn't exist anymore. The murmur that ran through the crowd was part shock, part understanding, as people began to piece together the implications of what I was saying. Pastor Hayes finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly as he spoke. "Emma, I don't understand. Your parents came to me 3 days ago, devastated by the news of your death. They showed me documentation from the authorities in Colorado. They were planning your memorial service through their grief." His words hung in the air, highlighting just how elaborate my parents' deception had been. They hadn't just told a simple lie, they'd created false documents and convinced clergy to participate in their fraud. My father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," he declared, his voice booming through the sanctuary with the authority he was accustomed to wielding in this community. "Obviously, there's been some terrible mistake. This young woman may resemble our Emma, but our daughter is dead. We've seen the evidence. We've grieved our loss." His attempt to brazen through the situation was impressive, but doomed to failure when faced with the living proof of his deception. The congregation's mood was shifting from confusion to anger as the reality of the situation became clear. These people had taken time off work, arranged childcare, and traveled from neighboring towns to pay their respects to someone who was standing right in front of them, very much alive. They'd been manipulated into participating in an elaborate lie, and that realization was beginning to generate real hostility toward my parents. "You've seen evidence?" I challenged my father directly, stepping closer to the front pew where my family sat. "What evidence? What authorities in Colorado? What car accident?" Each question hit like a hammer blow, and I could see him struggling to maintain his facade as the impossibility of his position became apparent to everyone watching. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the sanctuary. "Emma, please," she begged, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears. "Don't do this here, not in front of everyone. We can discuss this privately, work things out as a family." Her plea revealed everything about their mentality. Even now, caught in the most public lie imaginable, she was more concerned about saving face than addressing the fundamental wrong they'd committed. "Work things out?" I repeated, my voice rising with incredulity. "You declared me dead rather than accept that I chose my own life. You convinced an entire community to mourn someone who never died. You collected sympathy and probably donations based on a complete fabrication. What exactly is there to work out?" The congregation was hanging on every word now, beginning to understand the scope of what had been done to them. Dr. Williams, our family physician who had delivered me 26 years ago, stood up near the middle of the sanctuary. His face was pale with confusion and something approaching professional outrage. "Richard, Patricia, I signed condolence cards. I told my patients about Emma's tragic death. How could you let me spread false information about a medical situation?" His question highlighted an aspect of the deception I hadn't fully considered. My parents had involved medical professionals in their lie, potentially damaging their credibility and relationships throughout the community. The funeral director finally made his way to the front of the sanctuary, his professional composure completely shattered. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, you hired our services under false pretenses. We have a reputation to maintain. This is going to be a serious problem for our business." The financial implications were clearly dawning on everyone involved. Money had changed hands, services had been rendered, and contracts had been signed, all based on a death that never occurred. Chloe suddenly stood up and rushed toward me, her arms outstretched and tears streaming down her face. "Emma, I thought you were really dead," she sobbed, throwing her arms around me in a hug that felt genuinely relieved rather than performative. "I've been so upset, thinking I'd never see you again. When they told me about the accident, I couldn't stop crying." Her reaction suggested that she'd been as much a victim of her parents' deception as anyone else in the congregation. But even as I hugged my sister back, I could see my parents exchanging glances that suggested they were calculating their next move. They were trapped, exposed, and facing potential legal consequences, but they weren't going down without a fight. My father's expression was hardening into something more dangerous, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and was prepared to take desperate measures. "This is all a misunderstanding," my mother announced suddenly, her voice gaining strength as she shifted into crisis management mode. "Emma has been having some psychological difficulties lately. We've been trying to get her help, but she's been resistant to treatment. Obviously, she's having some kind of breakdown that's causing her to believe things that aren't true." Her attempt to reframe the situation was breathtakingly cynical, trying to make me look mentally unstable rather than admit to their fraud. The congregation's reaction to this new lie was immediate and hostile. These people had known me my entire life, had watched me grow up in school, succeed in school, and build a business. The suggestion that I was having a psychotic break was insulting to their intelligence and their memory of who I was. Several people called out in my defense, their voices overlapping in a chorus of disagreement with my mother's desperate explanation. "Emma's not crazy," called out Mr. Thompson from the hardware store where I'd bought supplies for my flower shop.
She's always been the most level-headed young woman in town. His support was echoed by others who had known me professionally and personally, their testimonials creating a wall of credibility that my mother's lies couldn't penetrate. Pastor Hayes was looking more uncomfortable by the minute, clearly realizing that he had been made an unwitting accomplice in something far more serious than a simple family dispute. Perhaps he suggested hesitantly we should postpone this service and reconvene when everyone has had a chance to process what's happening here. His diplomatic attempt to diffuse the situation was well-intentioned, but impossible to implement. Too much had been revealed, too many lies exposed for anyone to simply walk away and pretend this hadn't happened. My father made one final attempt to regain control.
The narrative. "Security," he called out loudly, as if we were in a courthouse rather than a church. "This woman is clearly disturbed and needs to be removed from the premises." But there is no security at a funeral service in small-town Ohio, and his attempt to have me forcibly ejected only highlighted how desperate he'd become. The mayor, who had been sitting quietly near the front, finally stood up and faced my parents directly. "Richard, Patricia, I think we need some explanations here. The city issued permits for this memorial service based on your representations about Emma's death. If those representations were false, we have serious legal issues to discuss." The involvement of city officials added another layer of complexity to the situation, suggesting that my parents' fraud might have legal implications beyond simple deception. I realized that this was my moment to take complete control of the situation. The congregation was primed to hear the truth, my parents were completely exposed, and I had the moral authority that came from being the wronged party. "Let me tell everyone exactly what happened," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. 6 months ago, my parents decided that my relationship with Jake Mitchell and my independent business were unacceptable. When I refused to end both and return to the life they'd planned for me, they began a campaign to isolate me from this community. The congregation listened in rapt attention as I detailed the systematic destruction of my business relationships, the pressure applied to clients and vendors, and the gradual erosion of my social connections through whispered campaigns of disapproval. I explained how my parents had used their positions in the bank and insurance company to influence other business owners, how they'd leveraged their church leadership roles to turn friends into judges, and how they'd ultimately driven me out of Millbrook entirely. When isolating me wasn't enough, I continued, when I still refused to submit to their control, they decided that the problem wasn't my choices, but my existence. So they solved that problem by declaring me dead and convincing all of you to mourn the daughter they'd always wanted instead of accepting the one they actually had. The church was absolutely silent now, every person present understanding the magnitude of what had been done, not just to me, but to them. Mrs. Carter spoke up again, her voice shaking with anger. "You mean to tell me that I've spent the last 3 days crying over your death? That I made a casserole for your parents and sat with your mother while she grieved, and it was all a lie?" Her outrage was palpable, and I could see similar expressions of betrayal on faces throughout the congregation. "Not just a lie," I replied, "a calculated fraud designed to generate sympathy and support for people who had spent months systematically destroying their own daughter's life because she wouldn't conform to their expectations." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and I could see people beginning to reassess every interaction they'd had with my parents over the past week. Grace had moved closer to the front during my speech as my parents' world collapsed around them in real time. Jake remained near the back, but I could see him tensed and ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. The funeral director was on his phone again, probably calling his lawyer to discuss the legal implications of conducting services for someone who wasn't actually dead. My mother made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Emma, please," she said, standing up and reaching toward me with trembling hands. "We love you. We were trying to protect you from making mistakes that would ruin your life. Maybe we handled things wrong, but everything we did came from a place of caring." Her words might have carried some weight if we had been having a private conversation, but spoken in front of 300 witnesses to their fraud, they sounded hollow and manipulative. "You love me?" I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. "You love me so much that you convinced an entire community I was dead rather than accept that I'm an adult capable of making my own choices? You care about me so much that you'd rather see me buried than see me happy?"
The questions hit their target, and I watched my mother's face crumble as the implications of her actions finally became clear, even to her. The congregation was becoming restless, their shock giving way to anger at being manipulated, and their sympathy for my parents evaporating in the face of mounting evidence of deliberate deception. I could hear voices calling for explanations, demanding to know how far the fraud extended, questioning what other lies they might have been told. The community that had gathered to honor my memory was transforming into something much more dangerous for my parents, an audience of witnesses to their downfall. Pastor Hayes finally stepped forward, his face grave as he addressed the assembled crowd. "I think it's clear that this service cannot continue as planned," he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of his own unwitting participation in the deception. "I suggest that everyone return to their homes while the Thompson family works through these serious issues privately." His attempt to disperse the crowd was understandable but unrealistic. Too much damage had been done, too many questions raised for people to simply walk away and forget what they had witnessed. As the reality of their complete exposure settled over my parents, I could see them beginning to panic in earnest. Their carefully constructed reputation was destroyed, their fraud was documented by multiple witnesses and recording devices, and the legal implications were mounting by the minute. But rather than accept responsibility for what they'd done, I could see them preparing for one final desperate gambit to avoid the consequences of their actions. The showdown I'd been anticipating was about to begin, and this time, there would be no way for them to control the narrative or manipulate the outcome. Emma Thompson had risen from the dead, and she was about to make sure that everyone in Millbrook understood exactly who had killed her in the first place.